Right, so Rampgill Ore-Dressing Mill, otherwise Wright Brothers Garage. So most of us will remember it as Wright Brothers Garage, and it seemed to have been, I've been here 30 years, and it seemed to have been a permanent fixture in the centre of the village of Nenthead. It was the centre of the village of Nenthead, if you include Overwater, and it was completely out of place. It might as well have dropped from outer space. It was such an alien building. Anyway, it has an interesting history. Now, difficult sometimes to find photographs. So there'll be a little bit of talking where there's not many images coming forward. So I hope you'll bear with me. So here we are. This is at the 1899 Ordnance Survey map of Nenthead before the new mill was built. You've got the road from Alston, coming through the village and away off up Killop, the road through Overwater and back over to Garrigill. Overwater hasn't changed at all. This is the Miners' Arms, this is the chapel, this is the reading room, now the village shop, and the school. It was the school then, about to close in 1899 when the new school was opened. Right in the middle of the village is the dressing mill, which you'll see in a photograph soon. So the village of Nenthead in Cumbria, for those of you who don't live in Cumbria, is situated some 35 miles southeast from Carlisle at the eastern edge of the county, bordering on Northumberland and County Durham. And this region of the North Pennines has been exploited for its metalliferous ores since Roman times and before. There's lead with its associated silver, zinc, iron, and a little bit of copper. Lead mining on Alston Moor, where Nenthead was the key location, was at its peak during the 18th and early 19th century. But in the latter part of the 19th century, the reserves were becoming exhausted and more expensive to extract. The further into the mine you went to extract the ore, the more expensive it was. And this was at a time when cheaper ore began to be imported in quantity from abroad, especially Spain. Zinc, on the other hand, had been mined locally but never exploited to its full potential until the arrival of the Ville-Montagne Zinc Company of Belgium. Excuse my French, La Société Anonyme des Mines de Fonderies de Zinc de la Ville-Montagne of Belgium, or VM for short, rather conveniently, took over the mineral leases of Alston Moor in 1896. It brought with it many new working practices, new operating techniques, new machinery, a lot of financial investment, and an international workforce. Excuse me. Here we see Nenthead's equivalent of the Metro Centre. It housed, this is what we're looking at with the clock tower, this building here. It housed the public washrooms and a butcher's shambles, as well as the village clock called Old Peter and the water tower. There's a very clean, suspiciously clean washing floor. There's a former school which had been built in 1821, and it lasted until 1864, when what is now the village hall was built and opened as a company built by the London Lead Company. And this old school became the mine offices. To the right of Old Peter, we have a shop owned by Mr. Cowing. And the little plot of land that it stands on was not owned by the VM. We'll come to that. And an advert in 1904 for Mr. Cowing said that teas and coffees were advertised as a speciality. So this is a different view of Old Peter and the market wash house building. It was nicknamed the Lion House because at night a barred gate was shut up. So it was some local wag called it, I think there was a Lion House. So this is the view that most people would see of the main road going through Nenthead. Again, there's Mr. Cowing's shop and the school. And this is a day trip out. People from Nenthead were quite ambitious in their day trips out. I forget whether this is to Whitley Bay or Sunderland, but you see they'd all have to go in a horse and cart to Alston railway station, and then off to Whitley Bay or Sunderland. It would have taken half a day to get there, and goodness knows what time they got back. And they would have railway train specials for occasions such as this. The construction of the new dressing mill involved the removal of much of the social and commercial centre of the village of Nenthead, which is what we're looking at. The Halt Whistle Echo reported in July 1910 that Peter, the village clock, the butcher's shambles and the former village school had all been demolished. This is a view from the southwest, I think, of the village. We see overwater here. This is Old Peter with the washing screens, the Ville Montagne, the schools there, and this whole network of railway lines going to the ore dressing screens built by the Ville Montagne, or after 1896 here. The VM is in full operation with its initial phase of buildings and working practices. This is not a tunnel entrance, by the way. The River Nenthead runs under this bridge and out the other side. So these railways served two mines. There's the Capel Clough mine, which is just about here, and the Small Clough mine just in front of these workshops. Rampgill, sorry. Yeah. So this is the old mill on the right, the corrugated iron building, and a band. This assembly was part of Queen Victoria's Jubilee celebrations in Nenthead. Every village had its own brass band. It's quite amazing to think of that nowadays. But here you've got the children in particular parading out. So this is the old dressing mill with the railway lines going off to that view that we've just seen, and overwater in the background. The old Rampgill dressing mill was destroyed by fire in 1905, but this gave the Ville Montagne the opportunity to construct a new dressing mill. So this is a steel frame building, not typical of Nenthead. There's a local tradition in Nenthead that the steel framework for the new mill was manufactured by Krupp of Germany, who erected it there as a standard test, then dismantled it and shipped it to Germany for the final construction. Unfortunately for the local legend, there's no proof of this. And when I've given this talk before and engineers have seen this photograph, they say it's highly unlikely that that would have happened. It was a massive steel construction, and it would have gone together as certainly as a Lego kit would have done. So in the British context, the building is a fairly early steel-framed construction with non-structural brick infill panels. It's only 1 brick thick. And the metal frame was left fully exposed. The construction is derived from the tradition of timber frame buildings. If you imagine Elizabethan timber frame buildings where all the construction, the timbers are painted black and you've got the wattle and door buildings, it's based on that. It's a technique which, although unusual in Britain, appears to have been quite common in Belgium and Germany. But the idea of the brick panels was simply to keep the wind and weather out. The circumstantial evidence for a continental manufacturer, and Krupp in particular, amounts to the following. The fact that the stanchions are at metric centres, or I should say were. I wrote when I first gave this talk because the building was still standing. They were at metric centres of 5 meters exactly. There's the local tradition about Krupps of Germany. You think where there's smoke, there's fire. There must have been some lingering, mostly lost tradition that Krupps were the builders, and the reasoning that the management of the Ville Montagne, who had many of their factories, dressing mills in Germany as well as Belgium just across the border, would almost certainly have approached the most favoured and trusted manufacturer of steel sections in Europe, Krupp, to supply a building that was typical of those already used by the VM company in continental Europe. I tried to pin this down to get concrete proof of this, or steel proof, and I made inquiries at the State Archive in Liège in Belgium, the University of Liège, the Krupp Historical Archive in Germany, and the Ville-Montagne Zinc Company itself as to the manufacturer, but I met with no positive result. However, there's a very strong possibility that the new Rampgill dressing mill was actually built by Friedrich Krupp, AG Grusonwerk of Magdeburg-Buchau. We'll never know for certain because the Ville-Montagne office at Nenthead unfortunately suffered a fire in 1930 that destroyed many of the records. So here's the building just about complete. What we're looking at in particular, you can see the village school here, the Wesleyan Chapel, which is now the Hive and Art Gallery and General Community Centre, Arts Centre, and the Miners' Arms. This is what I've called the tower section because it was about 6 stories high. So when you hear the tower section, bear this one in mind. This is the engine room, boiler room, and when it was steam powered, it had chimneys. And this is the scaffolding ready to construct the chimneys. So for those of you familiar with Nenthead, the tower section, the boiler room, it's about where the playground is now. So although the construction of this enormous dressing mill so alien to the area was an important event, it made only a slight stir in the local newspapers. The Halt Whistle Echo reported on the 23rd of April, 1909, the Ville-Montagne Zinc Company are busily engaged at present in pulling down their large dressing plant at Rampgill in order to install new, improved plant so that the dressing of the mineral ore can be carried out more successfully. The undertaking will cost the company several thousands. Frustratingly, there are no eyewitness accounts or photographs of the transportation of the enormous number of cartloads, which were presumably articulated carts, of steel stanchions and girders, the length of which could well have caused problems through Ulston's narrow, twisting streets and roads. However, on the 3rd of November 1909, there was a report that a considerable amount of increased traffic is being conducted on the Nenthead and Ulston Road at present. Large quantities of building material and plant are being carted every week from Ulston Station to Nenthead for the new dressing plant at Rampgill washing floor. When completed, it will be the largest dressing plant of its kind in the United Kingdom. This is a hint of things to come. Nenthead was at the forefront of mining technology. Out of all the British Isles, Nenthead was at the lead. 2 months later, Mr. Cowing's shop that we just see here disappeared as well. Now, as I said, this little shop and a plot of land around it was impeding, if you like, the construction of the Rampgill dressing mill because they wanted to build the boiler room where Mr. Cowing's shop is. So whoever owned that land had the golden key. I wonder if they could charge just whatever they liked for that little plot of land. That's something to think about. Anyway, it was reported in the paper, during the week, Mr. John Cowing, who has been carrying on business in the centre of the village of Nenthead as a grocer and provision merchant, has been removing from his premises, as the shop is to be included in the site which will be occupied by the Ville-Montagne Zinc Company's new and improved machinery. They really latched onto new and improved in those days. This must have been a last-minute effort because the VM only bought the buildings and the small patch of land in that same year, 1909. So this photo could have been taken on the day that the engines were commissioned. They look very clean, very new, the floor's spotless. It's even shining, I think. It could have been taken on the day that the engines were commissioned. So here are the German mine managers, Hans and Rudolf Rodewald, who lived with their families in Nenthead House on the way up, just out the village on the way to Killop. And notice, just behind this man's head, this enormous flywheel is going at full belt. And one step back and it's curtains for that gentleman. But notice how this looks like the chauffeur for the mine managers. Everyone else looks, well, with him with his tie, the knee breeches, knickerbockers and things. These are the management. Now then, hooray! So let's go back one, refresh our memories. So here, I reckon this is the day that the boiler engines were commissioned, with everything looking clean, and the bigwigs, the important people, looking important in front of the boilers. And here we see the workers. You can tell by the overalls that this chap here looks like a foreman, but the rest with the overalls, it looks like they're the blokes who do the work. Be interesting to find out just how many of these were Germans or foreigners, because this looks like not a typical Nenthead beard, and his moustache looks very exotic. It's almost a sort of waxed moustache. And the overalls, whether they're typical English overalls, I don't know. But anyway, I reckon these are the men who did this stuff. Nenthead and the Vale Montagne were ahead of the game when it came to electricity. They were able to generate electricity. It must have seemed almost magical to the people of Nenthead. Wherever it had its works, the VM looked after its workers and the communities, and the company provided street lighting to the village in the 1920s. It beat Ulster to the post when it came to street lighting. It took a little over a year from the demolition of the old mill to the inauguration in June 1910 of the new boilers to drive the ore-dressing machinery. The machinery had a capacity of dressing 200 tons of ore in 12 hours. And in all, instead of several thousand pounds that were mentioned before, the project had cost over £42,000 in the value of 1910. A newspaper reported with some pride that the dressing plant installed at Nenthead is the most modern and extensive of its kind erected in the British Isles. In common with the many Vale Montagne mines and dressing mills in Europe and other parts of the world, the zinc and lead ore produced was not smelted in Britain, but shipped via Newcastle to Belgium. So here's proof that the boilers were fueled by coal, and local coal at that. We can see that there was the alternative of getting coal from Alston or Coalclough, just over the county boundary, into the West Allen Valley. We can see that there was probably one cartload which carried 1 ton and 100 weight, brought by A.S. Teasdale on the 31st of May 1902, and G. Walton was the fireman. There are one or two of these fragile little scraps of paper that have survived, and it's quite miraculous what does survive. Now then, these are Wilfley tables, W-I-L-F-L-E-Y, a patent gravity separation process using sand on spinning circular tables. So it looks as though this chap here with the trowel in his hand was smoothing the sand or dressing the surface, and these circular tables spun, and the heavier lead settled outwards towards the center, from the center, I should say. But don't press me on this. You'd have to look it up on the internet. This is an interior view, obviously, of the whole mill. Well, actually, it was what became Wright's bus garage. This is the lower part of the mill. And here we can see the various hoppers. And these lines here are drive belts from shafts and axles away up in the roof. And there are sunken tanks here. And these railway lines, if you go to where Wright's buses are now, standing out in the open, the only thing that have survived from Wright's bus garage, from the Vale Montagne Rampgill Mill of 1910, are these tram lines here. They've survived all the renovations and changes of use and everything to survive until today. Here are the Wilfley tables that we're talking about, several of them. The figures in the distance give an idea of the scale of the machines and the tanks and everything. And the large door at the far end is where later on Wright's buses used to come in. And these stanchions, they obviously support the works, and they survived until Wright's day. And well, they didn't make for ease of manoeuvring the buses. The VM invested heavily in Nenthead, and another of their investments between 1903 and 1905 was the sinking of the 100-metre deep brewery shaft just outside the village on the way to Hilltop Cottages on the Killop side of the village. And it piped a head of falling water which sucked air down to the bottom to this Pelton wheel, and it created compressed air, which was ducted along pipes to power pneumatic drills at the forefront of the forehead of the mines. And the last piece of investment, the last piece of the jigsaw that the VM invested in to make the whole operation complete, came in the form of the introduction of 2 or 3 paraffin or hydrolium fueled locomotives, 2 foot 60 centimeters gauge to be precise, being continental, to work above and below ground, replacing horses to some extent. They could pull far more tubs than the horses. These trains ran underground and also overground to the Wellgill mine towards Brownlee Hill to the north of Nenthead. So here we've got the driver and his mate. Which one's the driver? Don't know. There's this lad here with his oil can, this lad here with a lamp, and this lad is Italian, part of the workforce, the international workforce employed by the VM. So here it is. This is complete. The mill is looking very new. The paint with the metal, yeah. Okay, so yes, everything is new. The paintwork is gleaming white or of a pale colour. The chimneys that we saw the scaffolding for, they're in place as high as possible to take away the smoke, the fumes. These things here, they didn't have an equivalent English name. They were Spitzkasten, but they, oh, Simon, can you remember what Alan Frater called these? Spitzkest or something like that. There's a sort of corruption of these, but these are sort of settling tanks and a gantry there. The hoist, the tubs arrived with, this looks like a whole lot of boughs there, waiting to be taken up the hoist to the top to go through various hoppers down to the bottom, crushed and crushed, to be washed and filtered in the lower part of the mill, and out the other end to be taken to the railway station at Ulston. But you get an impression of the size of the building. When you look, you think of the size of Nenthead Chapel here, and the tower section towers over it. And this is the new centre of the village. Old Peter's gone, and this has the machinery, which it contained the machinery that attracted a lot of attention within the industrial community. Engineers from all over came to look at what the VM had done and to see how it should be done. Technical papers are written in mining, industrial magazines, and thanks to the Vale Montagne, Nenthead was at the forefront of mining technology. Rampgill Mill was even used as an illustrative showpiece in a Spanish catalogue for ore-dressing machinery. You can see, here's the proof, it says Vista Total, a complete view. Rampgill Mill, the drawings incidentally proved very helpful. When you print them off, I was able to make a model of the mill. Actually, I should have taken a photograph of the model. I'm very proud of it. So by 1912, all was in place. Here are trucks coming and going to the hoist to go into the mill. And this is a gantry which led to either an aerial ropeway or another gantry to the waste heaps and those Spitzkasten. The chimneys with the cowls on. So yes, all was in place, and the mill after 1912 was operating at the peak of its efficiency. And before the First World War, the annual output of the Vale Montagne mines in Cumberland and Northumberland was about 2,000 tons of lead and 10,000 tons of zinc blend. which was about 60% of the total raised in the United Kingdom. But it wasn't for United Kingdom consumption, it went off to Belgium. Now, at first glance, it's hard to work out what on earth this photograph's all about. There was, of course, the byproduct, as well as the product of the lead and zinc. There was the byproduct of masses of mine waste. Here, we're looking along Gilgill Lane, over the roof of Ivy House, over the roof of Nenthead Chapel, to this waste heap beyond. It dominated Nenthead just as much as the mill building did. And this line here, I can only think it must have been some sort of screen along the top of the heap to prevent dust blowing over the village. I might be wrong, and please correct me if I am wrong. As I said, everything looked hunky-dory for the Ville Montagne. Everything was at its peak, as I said, but within a few years of commencement of the new mill operations, the onset of the Great War in 1914 forced the closure of much of the works. However, the British government then stepped in to provide subsidies for the production of zinc for home consumption. Because Belgium was an occupied country, occupied by the Germans, they'd taken over the Ville Montagne, and the VM in England had lost contact with head office. They had no instructions. They couldn't communicate. So there was a bit of controversy that they were I've forgotten the phrase, but not consorting with the enemy. But anyway, it was overcome, and the VM continued producing zinc for the home market. This assistant kept the mill working. The Nenthead Ward Meeting Minute Book of the 19th of March 1915 recorded that in other parts of the country, the war had affected certain industries and thereby causing unemployment. But in this, our village, we still heard the welcome hum of the machinery of the industry that was normal in this little place. During the final year of the war, 150 tons of material were being dressed each day, but of that, only 40% was mine ore, which was treated along with the bulk of the material from the old waste heaps. The insufficient produce from the mines was blamed by the VM on the lack of skilled miners due to their recruitment to the war effort. Within a few months of the end of the war, firstly in March 1919 and then in June, the government subsidies were withdrawn. In addition to this, the quality of the ore had deteriorated, as only the best had been taken in a hurry during the war for the war effort, while extraction and processing costs had increased by 2.5 times since 1914. These circumstances led the VM to close the mines nearby in Small Clough, Capel Clough, Rampgill, and lay off a large proportion of its workforce. By 1921, the only active mines in the Nent Valley were at Nensbury Hags and for a short time at Brownlee Hill. The ore dressing process was removed from Rampgill Mill to the smaller dressing mill at Nensbury, so leaving Rampgill Mill redundant. Having worked at almost full capacity since 1910, Rampgill Mill was idle from 1919 throughout most of the 1920s until the discovery of rich new lead veins just beyond the county boundary with Northumberland in 1926. The sinking of Wellup Shaft that we see here led to the mill being refurbished and brought back into use. In 1929, the ore was transported from Wellup Shaft to Rampgill Mill via a purpose-built aerial ropeway. And here we can see the cables, go one out and one in, and maybe this photo or another one, you can actually see a skip about to be loaded up. This building still stands, and so does another one beyond. There's a permissive footpath up there, and it's a lovely walk. You can climb up to the top of the mine heap and see away down the Mohope Valley, away down the Allen Valley beyond. Beautiful on a fine day. And these are now shooters' lodges, cabins. So people walking along the waste heap opposite Smeaton Terrace in Nenthead might wonder just what these shapes are all about. Well, they are the concrete basis for stanchions of a gantry built for the change in direction of the aerial ropeway from Wellup Mine in this direction, a change of angle, and then off to be received at Rampgill Mill. Here is another view of the gantry base, known in Nenthead as the arches, which make a good den for children to play in. In anticipation of processing the ore from Wellup, Rampgill Mill was re-equipped and modernised with the construction of a new engine house, the installation of two 200 horsepower fuel oil engines for electricity generation, new transmission plant and compressors. Unfortunately, the aerial ropeway failed after less than a year in operation. That might have been because of the boggy nature of the ground up on the moor. The uneven settlement of the gantry bases tipped the cable out of line. And so it just had a very short life. So the ore was brought out via the underground mine network via Nensbury Hags mine entrance to the smaller dressing mill at Nensbury, which is evidently able to cope with the output from Wellup. And some of it went to the other small dressing mill at Rotherham, at the other side of Alston Moor. So Rampgill Mill was once again redundant, and this further colossal capital expenditure had to be mostly written off because the prices of lead and zinc were low in any case. Not forgetting the Wall Street crash in the late 20s as well. Now we can date this photograph to the 1930s. It was used in the centenary album of the Ville Montagne in 1937. In the photo, we can see just how the dressing mill towers over everything else in the village. It also shows the aerial ropeway here, that gantry base that we've just talked about. The aerial ropeway comes in this direction and heads off. You see the cables going up to the top of the mill here. Another little cable went over to the waste heap, aerial ropeway, I should say. And it's amazing to think that this waste heap here dominates the mill, which dominates the village. And this now, this wall here, this is about where the footpath is now. This is about the level of the waste heap as it is today. This vast quantity of waste has disappeared. It probably disappeared during the Second World War, when mine waste was taken up to Longtown and Carlisle for aerodrome runway bay, to make them, to make the aerials and aerodromes, to make the runways for the aerodromes during the Second World War. Although times were not so prosperous for the VM in England, the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the company in 1837 was celebrated, as it was elsewhere in Europe. And so here are examples of the commemorative medals that were given to employees. I know a chap in Belgium who's collected these, so they still are available on eBay if you're interested. I know I must do something about it. So this photo, after 1937, the VM just sort of scraped along with Nensbury Dressing Mill and Rotherham Dressing Mill processing lead. The zinc had gone by the board. Rotherham mine produced only lead. Nensbury Hags was getting lead from underneath the county boundary with Northumberland, and Rampgill Mill was redundant. I think this might be a Second World War time view. The hoist has gone. We've got a few scraps of things, not a lot of activity here. This time, during the Second World War, or after 1929-30, the Rampgill Ore-Dressing Mill was out of use for over a decade, until the Second World War, when it was taken over by the government. In 1941, the Ministry of Supply, through its Non-Ferrous Ores Committee, in cooperation with the VM, examined several possible sources of lead, zinc and barytes in the area around Nenthead. This is from the point of view of their importance as wartime measures rather than peacetime economic measures. A sample of 100 tons of material from the tailings dams was tested, following which the committee believed that there was potential for rapid and certain production on a relatively large scale. So Nenthead was recommended for development and Rampgill Mill building was requisitioned. That same year, the Ministry of Supply set up the Non-Ferrous Minerals Development Limited, which between the January 1942 and June 1943 installed a new flotation plant in Rampgill Mill with a capacity of 1,000 tons per day in order to process material from the tailings dams and from the waste dumps, which were also requisitioned. This, I suspect, is another wartime view. There is some activity going on. You can tell by the smoke that's coming out of the chimney. So the tower section was in use. But otherwise, the mill is looking rather sorry for itself. The hoist has gone, as we saw before, and in the lower part of the mill, a lot of the windows are broken. The glass here seems to be missing, and this is just roughly sheeted over to stop the weather getting out. Maybe it's being repaired as part of the redevelopment during the war, but otherwise it looks rather sorry for itself. So the wartime process inside the mill was highly mechanized, which meant that the new company employed only 7 men per shift to crush and wash the ore. But outside, in addition, 6 men under a charge hand were engaged daily on the tailings dams, turfing, raising delivery pipes, etc. The remainder of the labour employed include an assayer and an assistant, an engineer and fitting shop staff and clerical staff, making an average of 56 people employed on the project. So that was good news for Nenthead. The Cumberland and Westmont Herald reported that the dumps of tailings at Nenthead estimated at a gross tonnage of 600,000 and preserved because they were known to contain percentages of lead and particularly zinc values, were also to serve the nation in its hour of need. Nenthead is serving the nation in its hour of need. Milling operations commenced in July 1943 and included the tailings from Nensbury and a small quantity from the Rotherham mine. And the operation terminated after the war terminated later on in the year, November 1945, at a time when zinc was a disappearing commodity in the world market. In 1948, the Ministry of Supply de-requisitioned the dumps and dismantled and removed its processing plant from Rampgill Mill. The government, however, retained the mill building, which was still owned by the Ville Montagne. The mill on this occasion was empty only for a few years because during 1948, the Imperial Smelting Corporation Limited of Avonmouth became interested in acquiring the mineral leases of Alston Moor. As a result, all of Ville Montagne's interests were transferred to the corporation's subsidiary, Anglo-Austral Mines Limited, with effect from February 1949, and the Belgian company left the area after 52 years of operation. So Rampgill Mill was refurbished yet again. A ramped vehicle entrance with one ramp in and another ramp on the other side of the tower out. Introduced to the northern corner of the northeast elevation, a new machinery was installed for converting raw fluorspar into acid-grade fluorspar concentrate for the use in manufacture of hydrofluoric acid. At first, the dumps around the village were searched for material, and then in 1950, the Heights mine in Upper Weardale was opened, and that employed 46 staff and became the main source of supply. Road transport, of course, coming up and over Killop. I don't know how they got on in winter, but they did. So the Heights mine was the main supplier. The average daily output at Rampgill mines was 16 tons. Hagg's mine was reopened in 1952, but closed down again the same year. Like the London Lead Company and the Vale Montagne, the Anglo-Austral Company also had a keen interest in the social life of the village, and amongst other benefits, had made a donation of £250 towards the village hall, which is what this old school became, towards the village hall renovation fund, and gave a yearly donation of £50 towards its upkeep. So those things, they're called the Spitzkasten, they've gone, leaving only their bases, and a fence to stop people hurling themselves off the edge into the River Nent. But you can tell this is quite new. It looks very clean. So the Anglo-Austral in operation. Excuse me. This is a photo of Heights Quarry in Upper Weardale. I haven't got a photograph of the mine, just the quarry where the quarrying operations broke into the old mine workings. The Anglo-Austral Company transported fluorspar and lead ore from Heights Mine for processing along with mineral from the old dumps in the Alston area in the modern flotation plant inside Rampgill Mill. Here we see mineral ore being examined in the next incarnation of Rampgill Mill. Sadly, I've got no more photographs of the Anglo-Austral operation, so we have to jump. Skip a few years. The Anglo-Austral operation lasted until early in 1961, when Heights Mine closed. And then on the 24th of January 1962, the company transferred most of its interests, including the mill building, to a consortium of local miners and mineralogists who call themselves Rampgill Mill Limited. Much of the washing and grading plant and equipment in the mill was dismantled, but some was retained to be used by the new company. The new company extracted lead and zinc from dumps left by the previous owners. Now, these dumps have been worked and reworked. It's a wonder that there's anything left, but nevertheless, there's always something. So the new company crushed it into a fine ore, which was then stored in stock bins of 150 tons each. We'll hear more about that in a minute. The machinery in the mill was capable of producing 10 tons of zinc concentrates in 24 hours, which was transported by road to Hayden Bridge and then by rail to Newcastle, from where, perhaps with a touch of nostalgia, it was shipped to Belgium. In addition, the company produced lead at the rate of 1 ton in 24 hours, which was also shipped to Belgium. However, Rampgill Mill Limited did not start production until later in the year 1962 due to unfavourable mineral prices at the time. But the next year, in 1963, the company was reported as being the only producers of zinc concentrates operating on a commercial basis in the United Kingdom. So again, Nenthead has a unique distinction. But sadly, the enterprise did not last very long, when 1964 proved to be a fateful year. A bad omen occurred in February 1964, when a 20-year-old labourer, William Bell, was found dead in a large storage bin. The first indication that something was wrong was when one of his boots was seen on a moving conveyor belt from the bin. The ore was conveyed from the base of the bins on a slow conveyor belt to a refiner, where it was reduced to lead and zinc concentrates. When the ore in the hopper, the storage bin, clogged up, as it sometimes did, the flow from the bins onto the belt stopped, and so it was necessary for a man to get inside the storage bin to loosen it up, which is what William Bell had done when he became trapped. Workmen used cutting equipment for over an hour to free him, and then they tried artificial respiration, but it was all in vain. William Bell was not wearing a safety belt, although they were supplied and he had been advised to wear one. The inquest recorded a verdict of death by misadventure, buried in an ore hopper. Excuse me. Death was judged by the GP to have been almost instantaneous.
Can I chip in there,
Yes.
Alastair? My computer's run out of memory. I'm going to have to stop the recording.